evening. Welcome to the Tennessee World Affairs Council's Election 2020 project. I'm Patrick Ryan, President of the Council. Tonight, we welcome you to the third in a series of special panel discussions of the key issues that American voters should be informed about as they head to the polls. We believe one of the things the World Affairs Council should be doing is to help prepare our community for this important function of citizenship. That's why our fall calendar has been turned over for this purpose in connection with the preparations at Belmont University for the October 22nd presidential debate there. We've been close partners with Belmont for over 10 years, and we're very pleased to organize these programs in connection with their service to the community. So I hope you'll be with us for more of these programs, including watch parties for the presidential debate next month and election evening. Let me also welcome our friends at the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg. They are joining us as partners in bringing you this program. It's a sign of the partnership of World Affairs Councils, especially since we've been pivoting to virtual programs, as demonstrated earlier this month by a terrific two-night program on COVID-19. All of those programs are available to you on our youtube.com/TNWAC channel. Next week, you can join Global Nashville with Carl Dean for a conversation with David Plazas, the Tennessean's Opinion and Engagement Director, about community issues, including new Americans and the plague of misinformation and disinformation. That's on Tuesday. On Thursday, come back for our Election 2020 panel on the Middle East. Our guest will be Dr. Paul Pillar, scholar, writer, and 28-year veteran of the CIA. Rami Hori, senior fellow at the Harvard Belfer Center, journalist and scholar at the American University of Beirut, along with Mona Yacoubian, senior advisor to the Vice President of Middle East and Africa at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington. They'll be talking about America's challenges in the Middle East and what we're likely to see in the region after the 2020 election. Tucked in between on Wednesday is our 1 p.m. weekly Global News Review. Ambassador Dick Bowers, Dr. Breck Walker, and I will dissect the international developments of the week. Check our calendar at tnwac.org for details and registration on all these programs. A quick note about your host, the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Now, this is a unique organization in our state, a nonpartisan educational nonprofit that works to bring you the world. Global literacy is our goal. You can find out more about our work on the website. While you're there, I invite you to become a council member and to consider a donation to our tax-exempt 501c3 organization. The World Affairs Council needs your support now more than ever. Last thing about the World Affairs Council, we are a nonpartisan educational group. We do not provide endorsements or recommendations on the partisan questions of the day, including the upcoming election. We encourage you to vote, but hope you will find many sources of information to rely upon. The assessments and opinions of our guests are their own, and we're thankful they're here to make them. Leading you through this evening's conversation is my great friend, Professor Jeff Overby, Director of Belmont University's Center for International Business. It's my pleasure to welcome him and thank him for serving as your chair for today's program. In addition to serving on the Belmont Massey School of Business faculty, Professor Overby holds the Edward C. and Helen J. Kennedy Chair of Excellence at the university. He regularly teaches around the world, including recent programs in Argentina, France, Poland, South Africa, South Korea, Spain, and the United Arab Emirates. No home buddy is he. In the community, Jeff currently serves as on the board of directors of the International Business Council of the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce, the board of directors of Sister Cities of Nashville, and the board of directors of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Jeff, welcome, and thanks for being our chair tonight.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you so much. I'm having a bit of withdrawal, not being able to travel right now, so I'm looking forward to getting back and seeing the world. Just a little bit of information about the center here at Belmont. The Center for International Business began in 2009 here in the Jack C. Massey College of Business. And our mission really is to build a global mindset among all of our constituents, both our undergrad and graduate students, our faculty, the businesses in our community, our alumni, and the greater Nashville community. And it fits very well within the the university, because the university's made a lot of strides in recent years from an internationalization perspective. It also fits very well with the community we're in. Nashville has really become a hub for multinational organizations, and we have over 333 foreign-owned companies here, including regional headquarters of Nissan and Schneider, Hankook, UBS, Philips, and are the global headquarters for companies like LP, Assurion, Caterpillar Finance, Bridgestone, Gibson Guitar, HCA. And what I also find interesting is that there's a lot of nonprofits that have emerged here with a global outlook, including Souls for Souls and Conexión Americas. And now Nashville's become a global destination for tourists, and about 1 out of every 7 of our Nashvillians are foreign born, which is a statistic some people don't realize. So it really makes sense for us as a university to be trying to produce graduates who can work in a global environment like this. And that's one of the reasons that we've been working with Tennessee World Affairs Council for years now, and are fortunate now to even provide them some space on campus as a host here. We have a similar mission. I think at the end of the day, we all believe that we want to build global citizens, and that's what we're here for. So thank you, Pat, and thank you for making this event possible.
Thank you, Jeff, and just another big hat tip to Belmont University. We really cherish the partnership we've had for about 11 years now, and the work that we've done. I'm glad I bumped into you 11 years ago, and we got connected and made all this happen. I think certainly the World Affairs Council is richer for it. Before I leave, I just want to remind our audience, please enter your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will curate those and have them for the panelists. The questions will come at the end of remarks from each panelist. So don't wait till the very end of the program if you want to ask questions of the first and second speakers. Jeff, I'll turn the floor over to you, and thank you again for being our chair this evening. I'm looking forward to a great show.
Thank you, Pat. So I'll ask each of our panelists to turn their cameras on so I may introduce them. And I will begin with, I'll begin in the order that the presentations will occur. So I'll begin with Dr. Richard Wike. Dr. Wike is Director of Global Attitudes Research at Pew Research Center. He conducts research on a variety of public opinion topics, including America's global image, the rise of China, democracy, and globalization. He's authored countless reports for Pew, and he's written pieces for The Atlantic, Financial Times, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, CNN, BBC, CNBC. Mr. Wike has also been interviewed by American news organizations such as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, NBC, C-SPAN, NPR, and non-US organizations such as Financial Times, The Guardian, El País, Deutsche Welle, and Al Jazeera. He gives presentations and talks to a variety of audiences and conferences, and is a well-respected speaker on behalf of Pew for sure. Mr. Wike, or Dr. Wike, forgive me, receives his doctorate in political science from Emory University. Next, we have Dr. Erica Owen. Dr. Owen is currently assistant professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on the intersection of domestic politics and the global economy. She examines how political processes resolve the conflict between economic winners and losers of globalization. Some of her recent publications, I picked a couple of titles out because they sounded really interesting to me: Foreign Direct Investment and Elections, The Impact of Greenfield FDI on Incumbent Party Re-election in Brazil, and also an article called Open Economy, Politics, and Brexit insights, puzzles, and ways forward. If you can suggest a way forward for Brexit, I can't wait to hear it. Dr. Owens was previously assistant professor in Department of Political Science at Texas A&M University. She was a visiting researcher in the Department of Political Science at the University of Zurich, and was also a postdoctoral research fellow at Princeton University. Dr. Owen received her PhD from the University of Minnesota in political science. And finally, we have a Nashvilleian on the panel tonight, so I'm excited to have Mr. Gary Garfield with us. Mr. Garfield retired as chairman, CEO, and president of Bridgestone Americas, and one of these companies I mentioned earlier that have really made a difference in Nashville. He initially joined Bridgestone in the legal department back in 1991, eventually rising to the positions of vice president, general counsel, chief compliance officer, and secretary. In 2010, he was promoted to CEO and president, and in 2016 was named executive chairman of Bridgestone Americas. He's highly involved in the community, has been director of Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce, an independent director also of Piedmont Natural Gas, director of Firestone Diversified Products, serves on the Tennessee chapter of Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, Nashville Ballet, the Middle Tennessee Council of the Boy Scouts of America, the United Way of Metropolitan Nashville's Board of Trustees, and is also a member of the American Bar Association and the Nashville Bar Association. He's published a number of topics in recent years, specifically on climate change in The Hill, the Tennessean, Tire Business, and has also spoken to a number of community organizations. Mr. Garfield has a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from Wittenberg University and a Juris Doctor from the University of Cincinnati. So we've got a great panel on hand tonight, and I think the best thing for us to do is to jump right in. So we're going to go in the order. I think these are all pretty broad topics, but I guess we'll start at the broadest level and begin with Dr. Wike, who's going to talk about attitudes from the research based on Pew's work, looking at global attitudes, a variety of different global attitudes. And then we will follow that with Dr. Owen, who will talk about specifically more in the area of trade and globalization. And then we will conclude with Mr. Garfield, who's going to speak about climate change, really from a corporate perspective. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wike. I will say that you've been a busy person this week. I've already seen you cited in the Washington Post, Politico, and BBC just this week on the research I think you're going to talk to us about. So this should be interesting. So the floor or the screen is yours, Dr. Wike.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for including me on the panel. Really appreciate the chance to be here and to talk with you about some of this recent work that we've done in terms of international surveys at the Pew Research Center. And in particular, what I thought I would talk about tonight are four different topics that I think are relevant for some of the themes that we'll all be discussing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about international public opinion towards multilateralism and international cooperation, climate change, trade, and then our latest on what people around the world are thinking about the United States, which is a report we just put out last week. And, you know, as you said, we've gotten some good reception in terms of the press covering it and things like that. So we've been very excited about that. So I'll walk through a few slides that highlight some of the key findings we've had in these areas. So let me share my slides with everyone here. And hopefully everybody can see that okay. So I'll walk through some slides that show you, some of the key findings we've had on all these topics. Before I do that, let me tell you just a little bit briefly about the Pew Research Center and who we are and what we do. We've been around for over 2 decades now. We're funded largely by the Pew Charitable Trust, so that's where the name comes from. We get funding from other sources too. The Gates Foundation, for example, has funded some of our work in Africa in recent years. We are a nonprofit. We're non-partisan, we're non-advocacy. We actually, as it says here, like to call ourselves a fact tank rather than a think tank, because we put such an emphasis on facts and data and empirical research. And we don't make policy recommendations or take positions on policy issues, which makes us a little bit different from other think tanks in Washington and elsewhere, for whom policy recommendations are often their bread and butter. We sort of stay out of that. We stick to the facts and to the data, and then leave the policy recommendations to others. We've been doing international surveys now for almost 2 decades, and we've been in over 100 different countries. Now, most of what I'm going to talk about tonight is from a survey we conducted in 14 countries this summer. And you can see the countries listed here, many European nations, as well as several Asia-Pacific countries, and the United States and Canada. I'll note that we actually planned to do a 50-country survey in 2020. It's going to be the biggest one we'd ever done. We're very excited about it. And then the pandemic struck. And in most countries where we operate, we actually do face-to-face interviews in people's homes. So obviously you can't send interviewers around to people's houses during a global pandemic. So we had to limit ourselves to countries where we could do telephone surveys. And that's what we did in all 14 of these. I'm hopeful that as soon as we possibly can, we're going to get back into those countries in other parts of the globe. But right now, of course, the COVID makes it a little bit different of a situation in terms of how we operate. These are all nationally representative samples, I should note. So the demographic profile of our sample very closely matches the demographic profile of a country's population. So we start out with some questions about international cooperation, multilateralism, and this is actually from a report we just released earlier this week to coincide with the UN's 75th anniversary. So we had some questions kind of getting at the principles of multilateralism. Do people think it's effective, and things like that. So one of the questions I thought was really interesting was one at the top here that we asked about coronavirus and global cooperation. So if our country had cooperated more with other countries, do you think that the number of cases in our country would have been much lower? Or do you think that no amount of cooperation really would have made a difference on this topic? And these percentages you see here are all median percentages across the 14 countries that we surveyed. So, by and large, about 6 in 10 across these countries think that more cooperation with other countries would have actually led to fewer cases in their country. So people see on this issue of COVID a real benefit to international cooperation. They think cooperating with other countries can really make a difference. The other 2 questions kind of get at broad principles really around international cooperation. The first one in the middle here about compromise. Should our country take into account the interest of other nations, even if it means making compromises, or should our country follow its own interests, even when other countries strongly disagree with us? And as you can see, again, it's about 6 in 10 across these nations saying they see some value in cooperating with other countries, even if it means making some compromises. And then the last one, actually a question we asked last year, should countries around the world essentially act as part of a global community to solve problems, or should they act as independent nations competing with other countries pursuing their own interests? And overwhelmingly, people see some value in the notion of a cooperative international community trying to solve problems. So, what we take away from this is that the broad principles of multilateralism, international cooperation, we see this in lots of other questions we ask, are very popular. Now, it doesn't mean that people always think it's working well, but the principles themselves get a lot of support. We also see mostly positive views about the UN itself. So here's our basic favorability measure. You have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the United Nations. Across the 14 countries, a median of 63% say they have a favorable opinion. You get some variation across countries, but it's overwhelmingly positive in most places. In the United States, it's 62%, right about where the median is. As we'll talk about in a moment, there are ideological differences when it comes to views about the UN in the United States and elsewhere. Japan stands out as the only country where you get less than half saying they have a favorable opinion of the US. And that might be tied to some attitudes in Japan towards the WHO and towards China that we can talk about if you want, but it's an outlier. In most places we see largely positive views when it comes to the UN. Now, people nonetheless, even if they have an overall positive attitude towards the UN, do see both good and bad things about it to some extent. So we asked, we read people this list. We asked, does this describe the UN? These things people associate with the UN. So again, these are median percentages across all the nations we surveyed. And 76% across these 14 countries think that the UN, for example, promotes human rights. They largely think it promotes peace, mostly think it promotes economic development, that it promotes action on infectious disease. So people associate a lot of good things with the United Nations. If you go down to the bottom of the screen, you can see a little bit more mixed reviews when it comes to caring about the needs of ordinary people and dealing with problems in an effective way. And this is pretty similar to what we've seen when we ask about other international organizations. For example, the EU, a big supranational organization. People think that the UN, the EU stands for very positive things like promoting democracy, promoting peace, but they think it's out of touch with ordinary citizens, and then they're not convinced that it's effective in dealing with problems. We see a little bit of that when it comes to the UN as well. Now, there are some demographic and ideological differences when it comes to views about multilateralism and multilateral institutions. One of them is along the lines of age. Young people consistently more likely to say they have a positive view of the UN. They're more likely in this survey than their older counterparts to say that the WHO has been effective in dealing with the pandemic. And they're more likely to say that their country could have benefited essentially in dealing with the pandemic from more cooperation with other nations. And we see this across other questions we ask too. Younger people just tend to be a bit more internationally minded. They tend to be a bit more supportive of international cooperation. And, as I said, in many nations, but especially in the US, you do see ideological and partisan differences on multilateralism, and especially when it comes to the UN. So here's our favorability measure. We've got trends going all the way back 30 years on this question. This is a percentage of people among Democrats, independents, and Republicans with a favorable view of the UN. And as you can see in this most recent survey, we get big, big differences. It's 85% of Democrats, just 39% of Republicans. Independents are in the middle. And, if you go back over time, we've always seen some partisan differences, but that partisan gap has widened a lot in recent years. And of course, this is hardly the only issue this is true for. We see it in lots of different issues in American public opinion, a wide partisan gap, and it's gotten bigger over the past few years. So, people overall support multilateralism. They kind of buy into the principles of it. They don't always feel like multilateral organizations, however, are in touch with people or that they're effective. And you do see some differences along demographic lines, and you see some differences along partisan and ideological lines. Let's talk a little bit about climate change. Each year in our surveys, we read people a list of international issues, and we ask them for each one, how big of a threat is this to your country? Is it a major threat, a minor threat, or is it not a threat to your country? And again, these are median percentages across all the countries we polled this year. So as you can see, when we do that, climate change comes out on top of the list. 70% across these nations say that climate change is a major threat to their country, even a little bit higher than the spread of infectious disease, which I think is a pretty interesting finding given we're living in this age of COVID. People are also concerned about terrorism, cyber attacks, spread of nuclear weapons, a number of other issues as well. But, climate change across these 14 countries at least comes out top of the list. And, last year and over the last couple of years, what we've seen is that the same level of concern really is true for other parts of the world as well. In Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, there's a lot of concern about climate change in those regions, in addition to the 14 countries where we've looked at it this year. And over the last several years, we've seen a big increase in concern about climate change. You can see that here for these 8 countries. This is the share of the public saying climate change is a major threat to their country. So if you take France, for example, back in 2013, you had 54% saying it's a major threat. It's up to 83% in this current survey. 29 percentage points up, up by double digits in many other countries, including, if you look down the lower left there, the United States. We've got a trend going back to 2012 in the US, and back then 45% said it's a major threat. It's up to 62% now. But as you might expect, you do get big partisan, big ideological differences in the US. And you get the same kind of patterns in other countries as well. So this is the percentage of people on the political right, center, and left in each country who say that climate change is a major threat. So if you look at the US, among conservatives, it's just 40% saying it's a major threat. It's 89% among liberals. So a huge, huge ideological difference in the US. The biggest gap we see among the countries we polled, although you still get significant differences along ideological lines in other countries too. People will put themselves on the ideological right in Australia. 46% of them consider climate change a major threat. It's 76% among those on the left. So, big, big difference there. We see big, big differences elsewhere as well. So, overall, people see it as a threat, but you do see differences within countries as far as how much of a threat people think it is. Now let's look at a couple of slides on trade. And here I'm going to go back to some data that we collected back in 2018 in a global survey that we conducted there in that year of 37 countries from all over the globe. And this is data from the US as well as from a number of sort of economically advanced high-income countries that we surveyed that year, and then also from emerging economies, middle and lower income countries that we surveyed that year. And what you see is that, across the US, across the wealthier nations and the emerging nations, big majorities tend to say that trade is good for their country. And that's been pretty consistent over time. I mean, it's worth remembering this data is from 2018, so things could have shifted a bit since we collected it. But by and large, this has been a pretty steady finding over the years. So people think that trade is good for their country, but they're less convinced about the particular economic benefits of trade. So does trade create jobs? Some skepticism about that, particularly in the wealthier nations in the United States. Does trade increase wages? Again, especially in the US and the advanced economies, a lot of skepticism about that. Does trade decrease prices? Not many people tend to think that it does. So, it's a little bit similar to what we see on multilateralism to me, that people kind of buy into the broad principles, but they don't always think that it's, they don't always believe in the specific benefits. They don't always think it's working well. You can see a little bit of that here on this slide as well. This is data from the United States over time. The green line is that question we just looked at a moment ago: is trade good for the country? Majorities, it's moved around a little bit, but majorities have consistently said in the US, yes, trade is good for our country. But we ask a separate question about free trade agreements, and we ask that percentages tend to be lower, right? So again, kind of the broad principle has a lot of support. But when you ask about specific trade agreements, people aren't necessarily as convinced that those are having a good impact for them. And then the last, topic of the four I'll touch on is, what are people thinking internationally about the United States? This is a topic we've been looking at now for over 2 decades. It does tend to be one of our more popular topics. As I said, we have gotten a lot of press pickup, a lot of web traffic, all the metrics we look at since we put the report out, policymakers referencing it. Vice President Biden actually mentioned it during his CNN town hall last week. So we've been very pleased with the reception. It tends to be one that people are very interested in. And in part, I think it's because it's been such an interesting story over the last decade. There've been a lot of ups and downs, a lot of changes, and we see some changes again this year. So these are sort of our baseline questions of what the world is thinking about the United States. How much confidence do you have in the US president to do the right thing in world affairs? And do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the United States? And these, again, are median percentages across the 13 countries where we asked these questions. We didn't ask them in the United States. So as you can see, the findings are pretty negative. Just 16% right now say they have confidence in President Trump. 83% say they lack confidence in him. Somewhat better for US favorability, but still not good. Just 34% say they have a favorable opinion of the United States. 64% say they have a negative one. And as you'll see in a moment, both of these measures are much lower than what we saw during the Obama presidency. So here is that favorability measure for 6 countries where we've been, conducting the survey pretty consistently over time. And in all 6, it's at or near a record low. So if you look at the UK, Just 41% this year say they have a favorable opinion of the US in the UK. That's the lowest number we've seen over the past 20 years. In France, it's 31%. That's the same number we got back in a March 2003 survey. You see that dip in the early 2000s. That was in March 2003 in a survey we conducted right before the Iraq War. So really at the height of European-US tensions around the Iraq War, we see those same low ratings today. Very similar finding in Germany, 26% favorable. That's almost the same as the 25% favorable that we saw back in that March 2003 survey. Record lows in Japan, Canada, Australia, some other countries as well. So in terms of our data, this is something of a low point in terms of assessments of the US, at least among many of our key allies and partners. Now here's the trend on that confidence question. This is one we've now asked about 3 different presidents. And here's some trend data for 4 Western European countries that we've surveyed pretty consistently over the years. If you go back to the beginning of the Bush era, he starts out mostly unpopular, not too bad in Germany, 51% confidence there. But his numbers go down over the course of his presidency. Key elements of his foreign policy are not popular in Western Europe. That brings his numbers down. He leaves office in 2008, pretty unpopular. You can see the big spike up in 2009 for President Obama, which really, unusually high numbers for any politician in some of these countries. In France and Germany that year, more than 90% said they had confidence in him to do the right thing. His numbers move around a little bit over the course of his presidency for a variety of reasons, but still he leaves office very popular, getting very high ratings. You can see the steep plunge for President Trump in 2017. His numbers have moved around a little bit over the past few years, but still very low. And in many cases, look pretty similar to what we saw for Bush back in 2008. Although I think some of the dynamics behind those numbers are a little bit different. That's something maybe we can talk a little bit about. Now, President Trump isn't the only world leader that we ask about. We also ask about Chancellor Merkel. We ask about Macron, Boris Johnson, Putin, Xi Jinping. And again, these are median percentages across all the nations where we ask the question. And as you can see, when we look at the data, Chancellor Merkel gets the highest ratings, right? 76% across these countries, have confidence in her. So very high rating. That's consistent with the last few years. She's gotten the best ratings among the world leaders that we've tested. Mostly positive marks too for President Macron. Mixed views about Boris Johnson, pretty evenly divided between confidence and no confidence. Mostly negative reviews for Putin and for Xi, although not as negative as we see for President Trump. Then that's one of the findings that has gotten some attention, right? That people don't have good things to say about Putin or Xi, but Trump actually gets the most negative ratings on the survey. Now, one of the reasons why we've seen some declines in ratings for the US over the past year, I think, is tied to perceptions of how well we've dealt with the pandemic. So we asked people, first of all, about their own country, how well they think their own country has dealt with it. And by and large, people tend to think their own countries have done a good job of dealing with the outbreak. A median of 74% across these nations say their own country has done a good job, although there are some exceptions. The UK is one, less than half there say that they think their country's done a good job with it. We also asked this question in the US, and it's less than half in the United States as well, although attitudes in the US on this question, as you might expect, break down along partisan lines pretty sharply. The WHO mostly gets good marks for how it's dealt with the pandemic, mostly good reviews for the European Union. Mostly poor marks for China. 60% say it's done a bad job of handling the outbreak. But the reviews for China are not as negative as the ones that the United States gets on the survey. 84% say the US has done a bad job of handling the coronavirus. Just 15% say the US has done a good job. And I think, those perceptions are one of the major reasons why we see this downturn in US favorability over the past year. And I'll leave it there. I'll just maybe wrap it up with just some ways I think that some of these findings tie together. we've all, I think, heard and read, a lot of discussion over the past few years about the health or the lack of health of, the liberal world order. And I think what our surveys in part show is that some key elements of that world order remain popular, at least in principle. Things like, trade, globalization, multilateralism. People buy into at least the broad principles of those things in many ways, but they're not satisfied with how they're working. And they think the institutions that sort of are in charge of those things in some ways aren't always in touch with average citizens. And then when you look at the hegemon of that world order, the United States, people aren't very happy in lots of ways with how the United States is working or what it's doing in world affairs right now, particularly when it comes to certain policies that the U.S. has pursued, like pulling out of the climate accords, like pulling out of trade agreements, like withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, pulling back from multilateral agreements and approaches to world affairs is something we've seen people in our surveys, at least, being very unhappy with. So I don't think people have given up on the United States, but they are unhappy with a lot of things the United States has done over the last few years. And they're looking for leadership in many ways from the United States that they don't necessarily see right now. So I'll stop there, Jeff, and hand it back over to you, and happy to take any questions that people have.
Thank you, Dr. Wike. Thank you so much. I think I'm going to ask one question while we're waiting for some outside questions to come in. I know there was one slide that I noticed that you also addressed that ideology of the respondents was part of the data. On all of these questions, did you measure ideology of respondents, and if so, were there significant differences as we find in the US data typically?
Yeah, in terms of ideology among some of in the other countries.
The non-US respondents, yes.
Yeah, you often see some of the same patterns, although the differences often aren't as strong. So like you'll see left-right differences on climate change, on multilateralism, on things like that in other countries as well, but the gaps usually aren't as strong as what you see in the United States. We also see differences in terms of along ideological lines in terms of what people in other countries think of the U.S. You tend to see somewhat more positive views often on the right side of the political spectrum. And when it comes to President Trump in particular, you do see more support for him and for his policies often among supporters of right-wing populist parties in Europe, for example. So, people who say they have a positive view of Vox in Spain or AfD in Germany, those people still don't tend to give President Trump particularly high ratings, but they give him higher ratings than others do in countries like Spain and Germany.
Great. We have a question from looks like, I believe, from Alan. In the U.S., are there any issues about which the differences are less polarized than 4 years ago? I guess that's a good question. Has there been any issue where the polarization has improved rather than worsened?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know that I can give you an example. It doesn't mean there aren't some. I'd want to take your question back to some of my colleagues who do more domestically than I do. Say, where have we seen polarization decline? I'm not sure. Maybe others on the panel have some thoughts. We've done a lot at the center that really documents the growing polarization, not only over the last 4 years, but over the last couple of decades. And one of the things that also has increased is what a lot of people talk about as being sort of negative partisanship, negative views. So not only sort of differences on issues increasing, but negative views about the other side increasing, right? People just having Democrats having a more negative view of Republicans, Republicans having a more negative view of Democrats, people saying they wouldn't want their son or daughter to marry someone of the opposite party. They don't want to live near people of the opposite party, and things like that. So, the partisanship and the polarization, it's certainly increased in recent years across issues, but this other aspect of just seeing the other side in a more negative light has increased as well.
We have another question from Facebook Live, which is also a bit related to ideology, and it's about the climate change data. Was there any data on how many of those people are actually change deniers as compared to those who who believe it's an issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't ask that. We haven't asked that internationally. You know, it's a hard. It's kind of we've toyed with it. It's actually a little bit of a hard thing to ask a survey question about. I mean, you do see internationally, I'd say that the United States often does stand out a bit as being a bit less concerned maybe than some other countries in certain aspects of the climate change issue. I think that is changing, however. You know, as that one graph showed, concern in the U.S. has increased a lot. So a few years ago when we were doing these surveys, the U.S. was a bit of an outlier. It's less so now, although, you know, it's really the right side of the political spectrum in the U.S. that remains an outlier. If you look at Democrats, you know, they look a lot like people on the left in Europe look. You know, they don't look really very different, but conservatives, Republicans still look pretty different. So the U.S. is becoming more like the rest of the world on some of this, but those ideological divisions are still there in the U.S. that make it a little bit different.
Question from Pat. The opinion of Japan being so low about the United Nations, do you have anything to indicate what the reasons behind that might be?
Yeah, it is a bit of an outlier, and you know, so I think there are a couple of kind of possibilities. We actually talked to some of our research partners in Japan about this when we saw this data too, to get some ideas. I mean, I think it's tied in part to views about China and to views about the WHO. I mean, as you might expect, I mean, views towards China are very negative in Japan. They're typically, it's either Japan or Vietnam when it's in our surveys, give China its lowest ratings, you know, anywhere in the world when we do these surveys. And I think you know, in the WHO gets relatively poor marks in Japan as well. So I think that, you know, one of the issues might be that some in Japan at least see China see the WHO as being a little bit too tied to China as regarding this most recent crisis. And that's hurt views of both the WHO and the UN, which of course works with the WHO pretty closely.
And I think we'll have one final question so we can move on to our next panelist. But what's been the general reaction to the publication of your report from, especially about the foreign attitudes from the Trump administration?
Yeah, well, we haven't really heard anything from the administration itself. As I said, this is a report, you know, this is a topic that we often get a lot of attention from policymakers and from the press on, and certainly this version of that report, based on the 2020 survey, has definitely done that. I mentioned, you know, Vice President Biden referenced it during his town hall, for example. Haven't really heard anything from the administration, but yeah, this is a report that, you know, I think regularly each year when we put it out tends to get a lot of attention because it's such a you know, kind of a vital issue for American foreign policy. You know, how are we seen around the world? What do people think about not only, you know, who is in the White House, but what do they think about our policies and things like that is what we've looked at over the years. What do they think of different elements of American soft power? So we have found a big audience among policymakers over the years for it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Wike. If you are able, we'd love for you to hang around till the end and see if there's additional questions, if we have time for additional questions. So
thank you.
Okay. So, Dr. Owens, we saw some data there about skepticism about trade, which is interesting given some of your research. And so I'll be curious to know, I don't know if that's specifically what you're going to address, but it is interesting that people tend to believe trade's a good thing when you talk broadly, but then when you get down to specifics, there's a little more skepticism. So we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I think there are a lot of interesting things in the previous presentation that relate to what I'm going to talk about. And so, you know, with everything that's going on domestically, it can be a little bit easy to sort of forget about, you know, what's been going on with trade. And you know, there have been some really big shifts in the Trump administration sort of compared to previous administrations in terms of being much more sort of vocally anti-trade or really questioning the way trade has been conducted by the United States through free trade agreements, through its sort of interactions in the sort of international institutions. So there's sort of a lot to talk about. So first, just to make sure we're sort of all, on the same page, a little refresh, Trade 101 in terms of, we hear a lot these days about the trade deficit. And of course, like what we're talking about there is imports minus exports. For, over 20 years, the United States has run a trade deficit where we import more than we export. And that generally has a pretty negative connotation. But it does obscure like a couple of big benefits to trade. For consumers, regardless of what they think about prices, consumers benefit a lot from trade. We have access to cheaper goods and more variety. And so you can just think about, the shirt you're wearing, the phone you're using, the laptop you're, watching this on, to sort of understand some of the benefits that we get from trade as consumers. Another really important benefit, and you talked about this in your introduction, Jeff, about the importance of exports and foreign direct investment to our economies, especially the state of Tennessee, which is a huge exporter and has a really large presence of multinational firms, both foreign and US. And these US firms, they rely a lot on imported inputs. So the parts that go into auto manufacturing. And so those are really big benefits that help US producers be competitive, both in our domestic market and internationally. And those jobs that are supported by exports and those jobs that are supported by foreign direct investment tend to be really well-paying jobs relative to sort of jobs that are not related to trade. But all of those sort of like big benefits aside, there's just no question that changes in the nature of production, so globalization as well as automation, hurt some workers and they hurt some communities. And those can be really sort of devastating and concentrated impacts. So I'm from Rochester, New York, which is the home of Kodak, and I live in Pittsburgh now. And so it's really clear that globalization does not work for everyone. And I think the question that we still struggle with is what to do about that. How can we make the global economy work in a way that allows us to harness those benefits while helping workers, helping families, helping communities that have been negatively affected sort of navigate that transition. And so I'll just mention a couple of sort of big issues related to trade and sort of, what we've seen over the last few years from the Trump administration. So of course, one big thing has been the US-China trade war. And so you may remember when President Trump took office, one of his first priorities and something he has focused on for a long time have been these sort of longstanding tensions related to China's unfair trade practices from when they joined the WTO in 2001. And there are very real issues there. A lot of evidence of sort of illegal subsidies, forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft. So there are some pretty big issues there. And so the approach of the Trump administration has been a little bit different to some previous administrations where they've tried to sort of compel China to make changes through these tariffs and sort of unilaterally sort of escalating tariffs. And so, of course, I've got a typo on my slide that's embarrassing. Tariffs are taxes on imports. And so you can think about this, if you want to buy $100 crib and there's a 25% tax on that, and this is like one item facing such a tax, that's a $25 tax that either the company that's importing the product is paying or that they are passing on to you, the consumer. And so, this accumulation of tariffs has really hurt US consumers and especially lower income families. So some estimates of sort of the cost of these tariffs through the end of 2019 has been, in the range of $1,000 per household. So, that is not an insignificant amount of money, especially for, families on a more limited income. US producers have faced retaliation. And so I know you have a lot of soybean farmers in Tennessee. And this has been sort of the biggest and best example of US exporters facing pretty brutal retaliation from China, and it's led to huge decreases in the price of soybeans, huge loss of markets in terms of soybeans. And the last thing I'll sort of mention has been the sort of higher cost for US firms, right? And so auto manufacturers, furniture salesmen, all of these companies that rely on those imported goods or services that they sell, find themselves less competitive, whether that's abroad or at home. And so from like 2007 and especially in 2017 to 2019, we saw this huge escalation. End of December last year, they announced a phase 1 deal. And so in a very short summary, right? Like it's good that the trade war is not escalating at this point. It's not clear that the United States got a lot out of this process so far in terms of addressing real structural change that needs to happen in the Chinese economy. And sort of this whole process has come at like a really high cost for the US economy. China has agreed to purchase, $200 billion worth of additional goods, but especially in the sort of world that we're in now with the pandemic, they're pretty unlikely to meet that target. So, there's a lot to still sort of, a lot yet to happen in terms of figuring out sort of like what the relationship between China and the United States is going to be going forward, either under another Trump presidency or under a Biden one. And sort of just, quickly, you can see here like how different the landscape is between 2018 when, goods, US exports to China faced an 8% tariff compared to 2020, February when they're facing a 20% tariff. So it's just been like a huge escalation, unlike that which we have seen in a lot of, in recent memory. So then quickly just sort of mention a couple of things related to trade relations with our allies. And so, of course, I should mention sort of like one of the big priorities for the Trump administration was to renegotiate NAFTA. And so the new NAFTA, which is the USMCA, went into effect July 1. And some of the big changes there were hopefully stronger protection for workers, hopefully stronger protection for the environment. And sort of one of the big, other big changes, and this really relates to Tennessee in terms of like auto manufacturing, is higher content requirement for goods, for components of cars that are produced in Canada and the United States, higher sort of content sort of within the NAFTA area in order to qualify for sort of preferential treatment. And so, whether this actually brings back manufacturing jobs, I'm not sure that that's actually what's going to happen. But, that was definitely a goal of the Trump administration through this renegotiation. And it's partly, why they were able to get, even some like US labor unions on board with this thing. The other big sort of thing that has happened during the Trump administration and is still ongoing are steel and aluminum tariffs. So a really particular focus of the president and his administration has been on security issues related to trade, or the potential for imports to pose a national security issue. And so a centerpiece of the president's trade policy has been this 25% tariff on imported steel, 10% on imported aluminum. And, that has been directed at, even our biggest allies, our closest trade partners like Canada, Mexico, the EU, and others. And there's two sort of problems here. One has been the retaliation that our exporters have faced, including, the EU put a big tax on whiskey, for instance. But the broader problem, and I think this relates to sort of a big question about how we can make trade work better, is that US firms, so many US firms are so integrated into sort of a global supply chain. They import so many of their inputs, including steel, including aluminum, that, actually these tariffs have hurt more workers, have hurt more firms that rely on using those metals as part of their production process than it has actually sort of created jobs in terms of the production of that sort of metal at the initial point. So, 1 in 6 jobs is related to the primary production of, say, steel, and then, the other 5 out of 6 jobs are related to actually using that steel in the production process. And so, I'll show you in just a second here sort of the impact on manufacturing jobs. Businesses, as they face these higher costs and uncertainty, have been really reluctant to engage in investment, which is, of course, also a big concern. And so, here's just a quick example of, sort of the relationship between manufacturing output, manufacturing employment, and the tariffs that we've seen administered under the Trump administration. So again, I just want to point out that, there's 2 issues here. Import protection, so putting a tariff on imported steel could create a small number of jobs in the steel industry. But the fact that there are those higher input prices plus foreign retaliation, has sort of negatively affected actually the amount of manufacturing jobs in the US. And, we've seen US Steel laying off workers in Pennsylvania, GM idling factories, right? And this is all in the face of sort of slower growth in general. So, in my opinion, protection is not going to be the way that we sort of help American workers and American communities sort of bounce back from or adjust to sort of the negative impacts of global competition, right? Firms in the face of, uncertain trade can just automate, and there's a bunch of examples of that as well. So if you make trade harder for firms, then they might engage in automation. And so in the interest of time, I'll just briefly mention something that you may see in the news because it's been in the news the last few weeks, the World Trade Organization. And so it's been in the news quite a bit over the last few years, but last week the US lost a case against China. The WTO ruled that the tariffs that the United States imposed on China were illegal. And so now China has the ability to retaliate. And I should note that the US also has a case ongoing against China related to this as well. But that really does feed into this narrative, I think that we've been hearing in the media and from the president that the WTO is biased against the United States. And if you actually look at the numbers, when the US files a case and alleges that another country has behaved unfairly, they win 91% of those cases. On the flip side, when the United States is defending itself against allegations of sort of illegal trade practices, they lose about 90% of those cases. And this is sort of the same across, pretty much every country. So, the Trump administration has really been quite critical of the WTO, and I think some of those critiques are certainly well-founded. The WTO hasn't had a lot of success so far addressing some of these issues, say, related to China. But currently the United States is holding up appointments of judges to the appellate body. And so the WTO is sort of grinding to a halt, at least in terms of its dispute settlement at the moment. And then the very last thing I just want to mention, because it would be hard to talk about trade today and trade issues without mentioning the role of trade in addressing, the pandemic to this point and going forward. There's a lot of concerns about how countries can continue to cooperate and address this pandemic in the face of shortages at home, say for personal protective equipment, supplies needed for testing. And so actually you see over here, a lot of countries implemented export restrictions. A few have rolled them back. And an export restriction is basically saying, no, we're not going to sell this PPE abroad. And that raises really big sort of ethical concerns about countries that would rely on that equipment. And it also opens you up to sort of a vulnerability where, for instance, the United States actually imports a lot of this equipment. And so if we start to see sort of a spiral of sort of protectionism in terms of stockpiling and hoarding supplies that can make the ability of all these countries, their ability to respond to the pandemic more difficult. And, this is evident, even as we speak, as we think about sort of vaccines and, how will vaccines be distributed, not just within a country, but between countries. And are countries going to cooperate to sort of have efficient production and equitable distribution of these vaccines? These are really big and important questions that we're dealing with. And the United States, just this week has sort of announced that it's not going to participate in this international effort to sort of develop this vaccine. So, just in conclusion, I think the big, the big questions to think about are, how can we make the economy work for everyone better at home? What is the role for U.S. leadership and influence in the world? And I know that the next panelist is going to hopefully talk a little bit about, the role of, business and global production and climate change, workers' rights. I mean, these are really big questions. And I think, up to this point, we're seeing sort of there is some clear distance between what President Trump's policies and I think what Vice President Biden's policies are and approaches are to trade. And so, I thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Owen. One quick question related to the trade issue, obviously, and FDI, not really FDI related, but it could be, has there been a shift in, we've heard some say that there could be more nearshoring or maybe bringing industry back, or has there simply been a shift to other countries for sourcing, or is it too early to really know the answer to that since these tariffs are?
I mean, so it's a little bit too early. I mean, we definitely have seen some countries, some companies not abandoning China, say, but moving to Vietnam and other sort of low-income, lower-wage countries in Vietnam, Bangladesh. And, some of that is just that wages in China have gone up. So I'm pretty skeptical that sort of nuts and bolts kind of, those jobs are not coming back. It's just too expensive to do those in the United States. That said, that's not to say that there won't be some kinds of new jobs created here onshore, but I think they'll look different than the jobs that went overseas, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. Thank you. And a question from the audience. It's a really good question here. It's interesting because TPP was seen as a hedge against China, but obviously it became a lightning rod in the campaign in 2016. Is there any chance that the U.S. could return to some version of that as a check on China going, down the road? Or?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's possible that the U.S. would be welcome into such an agreement, but one of the concerns I think a lot of people have is that by leaving, we gave up sort of our negotiating, our bargaining leverage and our sort of position of strength in sort of setting those rules. And so to come in later will be, I think, definitely a good strategy to consider. But I think it's not as easy to come in now as it was. And just as like a quick example, a lot of the components of TPP are now being reflected in like new bilateral trade agreements. So the US, Japan has just, in the process of signing a new agreement that looks a lot like TPP. A lot of the TPP provisions have come into USMCA. So yes and no, I think, in terms of, it's possible, but it might not, it's not going to look the same as if we had, sort of stayed the course.
Kind of related to that, a question from actually Ambassador Bowers. If we look at what the recent WTO ruling and the fact that it looks like the U.S. is going to do nothing in response, so it brings into question the the teeth that organizations like the WTO have. And we're seeing the U.S. pull out of a lot of these organizations. Is this necessarily a good thing or a bad thing? Can America really go it alone, or do we need these global trade organizations?
So I am someone who thinks that we need those organizations, and I'm someone who thinks that the U.S.'s sort of best strategy is to lead from within those organizations. But again, I mean, I think that the Trump campaign, it really did highlight the fact that there were real problems with the way that, you know, the business of trade has been conducted in the United States. And so, you know, I definitely see that. And, but I think, you know, those organizations are important, you know, for sort of maintaining, you know, just for their ability to sort of, you know, address disputes, provide information, you know, all these things that we rely on them for.
Well, we've got a lot of questions lined up, but we have one more panelist, so we better see if we have any time for questions at the end but move on to our third panelist here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Owen. All right, Mr. Garfield, thank you again. And we just like Dr. Owen saw, there was some data that Dr. Wike shared in regards to climate change. So I would be curious, I think we all would like to hear your perspective, especially from a corporate perspective around this issue. So thank you.
I'll do my best. Okay, let me try and share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So how do companies think about climate change? How does business think about climate change? And I'm going to talk in terms of a generic business, if you will. The answer will vary considerably by the size of the company, is it domestic, international, what industry is it in, where is it located, and a number of different factors. Putting that aside, if you will, for a moment, for companies to think at all about climate change, from my perspective, three things have to exist. One, climate change has to be real. Two, it has to be serious. And three, it has to be imminent. If all three of those don't exist, then I believe for most companies, there's no good reason for them to think about climate change at all. So I'm going to address those pretty quickly, but is it real? And I would point to two documents published by the Trump administration on whether it is real. If I can get my screen to move. There we go. The first document is a draft environmental impact statement published by the Trump administration in July of 2018. This was prepared because the Trump administration has proposed to eliminate CAFE standards that were adopted by the Obama administration. And under law, in order to eliminate those, the Trump administration has to prepare an environmental impact statement. This was prepared by the Department of Transportation in conjunction with the EPA and the Department of Energy. And I'll run through very briefly what it says. In chapter 5 of that document, about 80 pages long, chapter 5 is 80 pages long, it addresses climate change. And it says unequivocally, without any question about it, climate change is real and it is caused by human activity, in particular, the burning of fossil fuels. It notes that the temperature in the United States has increased about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 1800s, and most of that has occurred since 1970. And it says the climate change attributes of temperature, sea level rise, precipitation changes, and among those it notes the snow cover in the United States has decreased about 52% over the last 50 years or so, and ocean pH provide evidence of rapid climate change. It estimates that the temperature will increase an additional 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit by 2040, 3.6 degrees by 2060, and an additional 6.27 degrees by the end of this century. If those estimates are correct on our current path, this is all based on our current path. If those estimates are correct, that puts us way above the 1.5 degrees Celsius that is the target of the Paris Climate Accords, and closer to the 3 to 5 degrees Celsius range, not closer, within the 3 to 5 degrees Celsius range that is regarded as catastrophic for humans on this planet. It notes that by the end of this century, the sea level could increase by 8 feet. There's, as I said earlier, already substantial acidification of the oceans, endangering the oceans as a source of food supply for all of us. And finally, it says, based on our current path, there will be significant reductions in food supply due to extreme heat, weather events, ocean acidification, and there will be significant increases in mortality and morbidity from the extreme heat, poor air quality, aeroallergens, and diseases. The other document from the Trump administration that's very important on this topic is the fourth National Climate Assessment, which is a document that is required by law to be prepared every 4 years. Very extensive document. From an economic standpoint, the document says that the cost of climate change will be $500 billion, affecting such things as, this is not an exhaustive list, but such things as agriculture, health, productivity, and weather damage. And that $500 billion cost in this century will be per year. So a $500 billion cost per year. To put that into perspective, the Great Recession had an economic impact on this country of $250 billion. So double the effect of the Great Recession on an annual basis on our current path with climate change. Citibank estimates that the global cost of climate change inaction will be $72 trillion in this century. So I said earlier, for companies to even think about climate change, it needs to be real and it needs to be serious. There is no question it's real. There is no question it's serious. But is it imminent? And to that, I turn to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it estimates on our current path, we're heading towards an increase in the Earth's temperature of well over 3 degrees. And in order to keep the temperature to the 1.5 degrees centigrade, and that was 3 degrees centigrade, in order to keep it to 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is manageable for us on Earth as opposed to catastrophic based on the best science that is out there, we must achieve a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That's in 9.5 years, and net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So it's imminent. Against that framework, should companies even think about climate change? The answer is unequivocally yes. And I put together a little framework, if you will, as to how I think companies should think about climate change. First and foremost, they should think in terms of survival and hopefully thriving. And of course, that's really basic, but this This is what these are the thought processes I think a company should go through. What will climate change do to their product viability? And for some products, there is great question. If you're in the fossil fuel industry, I think you have a limited lifespan. Indeed, British Petroleum has said that they are going to invest between $1 and $5 billion every year on purchasing or creating renewable energy parts of their business. They recognize that the fossil fuel industry has a limited lifespan, and they recognize they're going to have to transform their company. But it's more than just the fossil fuel industry. Look at ski resorts. What about fishing? The oceans as a source of food is seriously in question. What about the insurance industry? If you provide insurance to whether it's individuals or businesses that are in areas that are at great risk of climate change, from severe storms along the Gulf Coast or fires, do you really want to be in that business? What's it going to look like? One executive in the reinsurance industry said, we are rapidly heading towards a world that is uninsurable. What about the mortgage business? If you provide mortgages to people who live along the coast, wow, what's your business going to look like? What kind of risks are you undertaking? In addition to product viability, geographic considerations. Do you have operations that are in geographies that are going to suffer dramatically from climate change? Just take agriculture, farming. If on our current path, based on the best science available, the Midwest, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, they are going to be perpetual dust bowls. What do you do about that? How do you manage that? Supply chain and raw material considerations. Coca-Cola has made it clear that it is concerned about, in this new world we are creating, they are concerned about their ability to just get water. And if they can get water, at what price? And what will that do to their business? Then consumer demand and preference. How is climate change going to change consumer demand and preference? At what point will consumers say, you know, I'm not going to support a company that isn't taking this seriously? So that's the first element of the framework. Another is legal obligations. Companies, executives of companies, board of directors have a fiduciary duty of care to make prudent decisions in good faith. If they are making decisions about the future of the company, investments, and so on and so forth, its policies and whatnot, without considering the impacts of climate change, one could make a pretty good case they aren't acting prudently or in good faith. And then there are liability considerations. Do fossil fuel companies have liability for their contributions to climate change? I don't know the answer to that, but I will say this. A number of large oil companies have come out in favor of a carbon tax. What they want in exchange for agreeing to a carbon tax is they want immunity from liability. So they think there's that potential. And then investor and shareholder demands. Investors, shareholders are becoming more and more cognizant of climate change and what it can do to their investments. Indeed, Moody's acquired a company named 427, which specializes in evaluating climate change risk for companies. How long will it be before companies are rated on their preparedness, their strategy for dealing with climate change as it will affect their business? BlackRock announced earlier this year that, and BlackRock is the largest manager of assets in the world. It announced that it will evaluate a company's sustainability strategy, particularly as to climate change, in determining whether and how much to invest in those companies. And then the Business Roundtable declared last year that companies have an obligation to take the interests of all stakeholders into consideration. So, point is, in thinking about climate change, these are at least some of the major factors any company should think about. Against that backdrop, what, in my opinion, should companies do? Companies should engage in a deep dive, meaningful, honest analysis of the climate change risks to their business, going through some of the things that I talked about earlier. Then a company should publish a climate change sustainability report. And that report should include an evaluation of the risk to the company and an action plan on how the company is going to manage those risks. And it should also include a greenhouse gas emission goal for the company. Indeed, about 1/2 of the Fortune 500 companies currently have such a greenhouse gas emission goal. And that sustainable climate change sustainability report should be updated annually with an updated assessment of the risks, the action plan, and where the company stands on achieving that greenhouse gas emission goal. Next, each company should place an internal price on carbon. Why? Because, in my opinion, it is not a question of whether we will have a carbon tax. I believe it is inevitable. The only questions are when and how much. So to prepare for the carbon tax and the impact it will have on the company, companies will be ahead of the game by putting an internal price on carbon, because that will affect how they run their business and how they invest in the future. Moreover, it's the right thing to do. Fourth, companies need to very carefully evaluate future investments against the almost certain inevitable carbon tax, their location, and product and supply chain risks. Fifth, companies should insist that all of their significant suppliers do the above. And finally, companies should educate their employee base, educate their suppliers, educate their stakeholders, and their investors, so that on what their strategy is to deal with climate change, so that there will be buy-in and less resistance to their strategy. There was a cartoon that I saw that kind of wraps it up, I think, in a wonderfully poignant way, and it is this. I think now's the time to look at new technology to deal with asteroids if we're the dinosaur. That's where we're really at now. So with that, I would be delighted to answer any questions anyone has to the extent I can.
Great. Wow, that's some powerful data there. And the question I was going to ask, I'm actually seeing several similar type questions. So I'll try and ask mine and those together. We saw data earlier on skepticism still about this, which is amazing. But is this something that you think companies and consumers are going to have to drive and move governments and lead on this? How are we going to, I mean, those numbers, I haven't even seen those high of numbers on all of the climate data I've read before. That's really frightening. So how is this going to happen? How are we going to make this happen?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I have a couple of views as to what needs to happen. Businesses need to get more involved in talking with politicians. And many are, believe me. There's a very significant lobbying effort by names such as General Motors, Coca-Cola, Apple, and Goldman Sachs that are lobbying the government, but they need to, all companies really need to step it up. The other thing companies need to do, educate, educate, educate. I believe strongly if the CEO of General Motors or wherever goes around the company or has other people with their blessing going around the company, educating their employees, factory workers, this is what's going on, and this is the threat that it is to us, to your job, to this company, to our country, that can begin to move public opinion. I also believe religion needs to get involved. And the Catholic Church in the Vatican has, but I believe a lot of, the data says that a lot of conservatives are skeptical of climate change. And I believe, and I could be wrong about this, many of those people are very religious, and that's fabulous. But if their local pastor in the Sunday sermon says, we have an obligation, it is a moral and religious obligation and duty to God as stewards of the earth to protect the earth for all of God's children. And if we don't act now, we're failing God. If people start hearing that again and again and again, that can begin to move public opinion, which will begin to drive politicians to act.
An interesting question from another one from the audience. You know, the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, obviously, and but a number of states said that they would uphold the standards. Have many corporations followed suit and are upholding those same standards? Yeah,
a number of corporations are. A number of corporations are setting greenhouse gas emission goals with the view of helping achieve the Paris Climate Accord goal of 1.5 degree centigrade increase in temperature, or Celsius increase in temperature, excuse me. So a number of companies are, but a number aren't. And make no mistake about it, in my opinion, and I'm not a scientist, I'm not the best authority in the world on this by any stretch of the imagination. We will not achieve that without government intervention. There's too much that has to be done. If we are going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by roughly 45% in 9.5 years, we're going to have to transform our energy sector. That isn't going to happen without government intervention. That government intervention includes, among other things, a carbon tax.
And you think a carbon tax is unavoidable?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's just no question about it. Mm-hmm. Whether it will be in time is the big question. But let's play this out. Let's say we don't have a carbon tax and we keep going on our current path, and the year 2035 or 2040 comes about and people are dying, our coasts are becoming inundated, all of the climate nightmares are starting. We see it now, but it's becoming more and more undeniable. At some point we will say, enough is enough, we must act. Humanity will demand it. We will demand it. It may be too late, but we'll demand it.
Wow. Well, thank you, Mr. Garfield. If I could ask all of our panelists to come back if we haven't lost anyone. Good. I just want to thank you. I'm afraid we probably are out of time for audience questions at this point, but I'd like to thank you. It was a fantastic panel. When I was looking at the topics at the beginning, thinking, how are we going to tie all these together? But it's kind of amazing how it all came together, and we heard some similar themes crossing through all of these. So thank you again for your insights and perspectives on what's ahead for the U.S. In these critical times. But I would like to say, if anyone has any final observations you'd like to share, please do so. No pressure. Well, yes, I'm sorry.
It was an honor to be a part of this. I really appreciate Belmont and the council putting this together.
Yes, thank you very much. Great to have opportunity to be a part of this.
And thank each of you for being here. And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. Please check the Tennessee World Affairs Council, TNWAC.org calendar. And be back next week at this time, 5:30 next Thursday, for a program, another one in our Election 2020 series. Lieutenant Commander Pat Ryan will lead a panel talking about the U.S. challenges in the Middle East. So should be very interesting. His guests will be Dr. Paul Pillar, Rami Khoury, and Mona Yakubian. Thank you again, panelists, and have a good night. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.